On June 17th, the US and Iran signed an agreement to end the war. Now, the intention was to have a 60-day ceasefire, and in that time, negotiate a permanent peace deal. We're about halfway there, and it's not going well. Last week, Trump said the ceasefire was over, and yesterday, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. The ceasefire is not holding, but if we don't find a way to hold it together, the larger peace deal has very little chance of success. So today, let's dive into it. Let's explore why the peace deal might hold and why it might not. The US cannot walk away from the war in Iran the way it walked away from Afghanistan in 2021 and Vietnam in 1973. In those cases, the US could walk away whenever it wanted to because nothing was really forcing it to stay there. That's just not the case here. 20% of the world's oil and gas moves through the Strait of Hormuz. So when the US assassinated Iran's government in February, they forced them into a corner, and Iran responded by resorting to the proverbial nuclear option. They closed the strait, cutting off 20% of the world's oil and gas flow. Today, every major economy on Earth runs on that, and that means we need the strait open. And as long as it's closed, everything is going to be more expensive for everyone for a really long time. I've seen some folks online ask, well, why doesn't the US just pack up and go home? The truth is, that's just not an option. Well, it's an option, it's just not a very good option. If we peel back some of the layers, we can see why. First, the US leaving doesn't mean the fighting stops. Israel's perfectly capable of continuing the war from here on out. Over the last several months, the US and Israel have caused so much damage that Iran is basically on the ground. And what Israel wants to do is keep kicking them over and over again to cause as much damage as they can before Iran can get back up. If the US leaves, that doesn't stop. Second, the people need the strait open. Yes, America has its own oil and gas, but the issue here is supply and cost. Even if the US could make up the difference with its own domestic supply, it would take years and years to ramp up oil and gas production. It's easier, faster, and cheaper to build peace with Iran than it is to magically find oil and gas, hire and train a giant new workforce, build all the rigs and pipes and refineries needed to produce it. You see the point. Maybe we could replace this stuff with our own supply, but it would take years and a huge investment to get there. The third reason is that the US needs to save face. Even if it didn't need that oil and gas, the world needs it, and it's America's fault the strait's closed. I understand people online who want to put the blame on Iran, but the truth is that if you put any country in their situation, you'd get the same outcome, and world leaders know that. What that means is, if the US walked away now, the whole world would despise it. And while that might not matter to the everyday American citizen who has no plans to travel internationally, it matters for international diplomacy. It would be one giant step back for the United States and one giant step forward for China. The fourth reason is that Trump and his fellow Republicans need the war to end because it's incredibly unpopular in the United States and they have an election coming up in November. If this war is not over, they're going to get pummeled in the midterm elections. Now, luckily for the United States and the Republican Party, Iran also wants a peace deal. Closing the Strait of Hormuz actually creates a diminishing returns problem for Iran. What that means is, the longer they close the strait, the less they get for closing the strait. Think about it this way. When they first closed Hormuz, the US had just killed the top layers of their government, and they were dropping hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bombs each day. But today, the US is doing everything it can to sign a peace deal. What changed in that time? Iran closed the strait, and they transformed America's behavior in a matter of weeks. The question is, what will they get for closing the Strait of Hormuz for another month or two? They won't get much. And as long as it's closed, they can't sell their oil and gas on the global market. Right now, both countries want peace. And that's why this peace deal has a real shot. While the US and Iran both want a peace deal, there's a good chance a peace deal won't hold. Israeli and US interests are genuinely misaligned, and Israel is unwilling to bend to American interests. Worse yet, they're actually willing to sabotage any agreement they dislike. And history suggests that's basically any agreement Iran could make. For context, let's go through a few examples. First, in 1995, AIPAC flexed its muscles in Congress and killed a $1 billion deal that Conoco had made with Iran to develop a few oil fields. The next year, Congress passed the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which penalized not just American companies, but any countries who invested in Iranian energy. In 2015, Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of Congress to speak out against President Obama's nuclear deal. Now, it's hard to overemphasize what a big deal this was. Instead of persuading President Obama, Netanyahu went around him. He tried to persuade Congress and the American people. He essentially interfered in American elections in an effort to destroy an American negotiated peace treaty. Unfortunately for all of us, it worked. Trump won the 2016 election, he repealed the nuclear deal on Israel's behalf, and now we're in another unnecessary war. Again. In 2021, when President Biden tried to resume negotiations with Iran, Israel sabotaged the talks by striking Iran's nuclear facilities. In effect, they escalated the conflict to make Iran feel threatened, and Iran responded by enriching uranium, which killed the negotiations. This year, we've seen the same basic pattern. After the US and Iran signed a ceasefire deal, Israel resumed fire with Hezbollah within 48 hours. Every time the US gets close to a deal with Iran, Israel sabotages it. And it's not because Israel is evil or wants to harm the US or anything like that. It's because their security interests are genuinely misaligned with American economic and diplomatic interests. Israel's theory of security is zero-sum. What that means is they believe that the weaker Iran is, the safer they are. Right now, Iran is on the ground, and Israel could get a lot of damage in before they can get back up. Their endgame is not peace. It's bleeding Iran dry. That's why they'll do whatever they can to sabotage any agreement the US would make with Iran. We're at a moment where US interests and Israeli interests are genuinely misaligned, and it looks like Israel's going to get its way. The US wants peace, and it wants it fast, but because Israel has the upper hand, they want the war to continue. Even the two presidents' personal interests are misaligned. Benjamin Netanyahu faces an election in October, with corruption charges waiting for him if he loses. If Israel is at war, he'll likely win that election, but the opposite is true for President Trump. The war is wildly unpopular in the United States because Americans are tired of paying for the security of other countries, and most of them understand that this war is not going to benefit them. If the Republican Party isn't able to end the war, they'll likely lose the midterm elections. Trump might even lose control of his own party in the process. So the two leaders and the two countries have opposing interests. So here's the basic problem. Iran will only agree to a deal if it benefits them in some way. But if it benefits them, then Israel will resist it, because from Israel's point of view, the better off Iran is, the more threatening they are. Starting an offensive war with Israel at your side is like starting a forest fire. You might be able to control how and where it starts, but you lose control the moment it heats up. In effect, the US is in a double bind. They can't stay in the fight because it's too costly, depletes too much of their munitions, and there's no obvious finish line, because Israel has every incentive to keep the fight going. But they can't leave the fight because if Iran controls Hormuz, then the US and the rest of the world pays for that mistake for decades, and the US loses big on the diplomatic front. The only way forward is to negotiate a peace deal with Iran, where they get security, the world gets a stable economy, and the US saves face. The problem is, they can't sustain an agreement because Israel will undermine it. The US has fallen into a trap set by Benjamin Netanyahu, and Trump walked right into it. Now the US has nothing but bad options. They can't leave the war, and they don't want it to continue. Unless Trump is willing to threaten Israel's foreign aid, he doesn't really have a play. And while he's been willing to pull that card on virtually every other country on earth, he's always made this strange exception for Israel. If you like this video, follow me for the next 2 videos where I cover why Trump agreed to this war and where his administration might go from here.